All right, so Romeo and Juliet. I know, right? I know what you're probably thinking back to high school English class.
Back to the balcony.
Exactly. But trust me, this time it's going to be a little different. We're ditching the SparkNote summaries, all that jazz, and going deep, deep into Shakespeare's actual words.
Straight to the source.
Exactly. And we've got this amazing ebook, by the way, from Project Gutenberg. It was, get this, published online back in '98.
Wow, 98.
Yeah, the internet was around back then, apparently.
Yeah.
But yeah, so forget everything you think you know about this play. We're uncovering hidden layers on all sorts of stuff.
It's amazing how much richer the play becomes when you actually, dig into the nuances of the language, the historical context. Like, we get so caught up in the romance of it all.
Right.
But there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Yeah. And one of the things that always kind of bugged me, even back in high school, was Romeo. Like, one minute he's all hung up on Rosaline, calling her the sun and the moon and all that.
Right, totally.
And next, boom, he sees Juliet and it's like, Resley, who?
Yeah, talk about whiplash.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it does make you wonder about this guy, right? But it's actually a really good observation because it connects to a concept that was really big during Shakespeare's time. Courtly love versus passionate love.
Okay, so like two different types of love then.
Exactly. So Romeo's whole thing with Rosaline, it fits into this idea of courtly love. It's idealized, kind of distant, and all about longing and pining.
So he's basically in love with the idea of being in love.
Pretty much. And that was kind of expected of young men in that era. It was like a societal game almost. But then Juliet shows up and everything changes. Suddenly it's passionate love, immediate, all-consuming, reckless.
Yeah, that sounds a lot more like Romeo, doesn't it?
Exactly. And I think what's cool is that it's not just about Romeo and Juliet as individuals, right? This shift, it kind of reflects these broader societal expectations about love and marriage that were at play back then.
Interesting. And speaking of adding layers, we've got to talk about the chorus.
Mm-hmm.
Because right off the bat, they basically tell us how this whole thing is going to end. It's like getting a spoiler alert in the first 5 minutes of a movie.
It's so true. It's like, hey, just so you know, this love story, doomed. This family feud, gonna end badly.
Yeah, thanks for ruining the surprise, Shakespeare. But seriously, it makes you wonder why give away the ending right from the start.
Right. It's a really bold choice, and I think it completely changes how we experience the play. We're not watching to find out if something bad will happen, but how it's all gonna go down.
It's like knowing the Titanic is gonna sink, but still being totally hooked on the story.
Exactly. And I think in a way it makes the whole thing even more tragic, right? Knowing their fate from the get-go.
It's like Shakespeare saying, pay attention, this is how it happens.
Yes. It's all about the choices the characters make, the societal forces that push them towards their destinies, all of that.
Okay, so we got Romeo with his evolving love life. We've got this chorus foreshadowing doom and gloom. And then there's Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone remembers that famous balcony scene, of course.
Oh, Romeo, Romeo.
Exactly. But I think what's easy to miss is how much deeper her words actually are. Like she says, and I'm quoting here, "O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, or if thou wilt not, be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet."
Powerful stuff.
Right. She's not just some love-struck teenager, mooning over a cute boy. She's like questioning the whole idea of names and identity.
Absolutely. She's like, why do these labels even matter? Why should a Montague and a Capulet be enemies? And that's what makes her so fascinating. She's already seeing through those divisions, the societal constructs that are keeping her from Romeo.
Oh, and she's what, like 14 years old?
Right. And keep in mind, women in Shakespeare's time, they didn't exactly have it easy. Their lives were largely controlled by men, by these societal expectations. But here's Juliet questioning those structures, trying to forge her own path. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, she's definitely not just a damsel in distress, is she?
No way. She's a force to be reckoned with.
So we've got these star-crossed lovers, their families at war, and a chorus practically begging us to pay attention to how this tragedy unfolds. But it's not just about Romeo and Juliet, is it? Their little love stories playing out against this backdrop of intense, bitter feuding that's tearing Verona apart. And it's interesting you mentioned Verona because we really get a sense of how much this feud is impacting the entire city. It's not just a family squabble, is it?
Not at all. It's like this open wound, affecting everyone. And we see that really clearly with the prince, right? His reaction to that first fight, he is not messing around.
He's like, enough is enough.
Totally. He could have just been like a background character, but Shakespeare gives him this whole powerful speech. He's furious. He even says, and I'm quoting here directly from the text, 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word, by thee, old Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace.
Wow, that's intense. He's basically saying their hatred is poisoning the city.
Exactly. He's holding them accountable for the damage they're causing, not just to each other, but to Verona itself. It's like he's reminding them that actions have consequences.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, with a warning like that, how does it still spiral so far out of control? You'd think they would learn their lesson.
Right, but that's the nature of these kinds of cycles of violence. They have a way of escalating, pulling everyone down with them. And I think a big turning point in that downward spiral is Mercutio's death.
Yeah, that's where things get really real.
Totally. The whole mood of the play shifts after that. It becomes much darker, more intense, and it really highlights how devastating those choices can be, even when they're not intentional.
Because Romeo doesn't even want to fight, does he? He's trying to, keep the peace, and it blows up in his face.
Which is just tragic, isn't it? He's got good intentions, but he gets sucked into that vortex of hatred and ends up making things even worse. Talk about unintended consequences.
And poor Mercutio, just caught in the crossfire. It's heartbreaking. Speaking of heartbreaking, we have to talk about Juliet's reaction when Romeo gets banished.
Yeah.
I mean, her brother was just killed, and she seems more upset that Romeo's gone than anything.
Right. That's a tough one for a modern audience to wrap their heads around, isn't it?
Totally.
She even says, Tybalt is gone and Romeo banished. Romeo that killed him, he is banished. And then there's that line, that banished, that one word banished, hath slain 10,000 Tybalts.
Oof. Poor Tybalt. It really makes you wonder how deep her grief for her brother really is.
Right. I mean, on the one hand, it speaks to the depth of her love for Romeo, right? Like, it's so powerful that it overshadows everything else, even family. But it also gives us this glimpse into what life was like for women back then. They had very little say in, well, anything.
So maybe it's not just about Romeo. Maybe it's about her own lack of control over her own life.
Exactly. Think about it. Her brother dies, which is obviously awful. But her life doesn't really change all that much, right? She's still stuck in this world where men call the shots. But Romeo being banished, that changes everything. That's her one shot at happiness, at choosing her own destiny, gone.
That is a really interesting way to look at it.
And Shakespeare was really good at weaving those layers into his characters. Juliet's not just a love-struck teenager. She's a symbol of the fight for agency, for control over your own life, which is something that still resonates today, centuries later.
Totally. Speaking of choices, can we talk about Friar Lawrence for a second? I mean, he secretly marries Romeo and Juliet, knowing their families are at war, and then he comes up with that whole potion plan. What was he thinking?
Right. Talk about a questionable life plan. Friar Lawrence is such a fascinating character, though, because he's so complicated. Like, you want to root for him because he's an idealist. He believes in the power of love so much that he's willing to risk everything.
He thinks Romeo and Juliet can actually end the feud?
He's convinced of it, but his methods, well...
not exactly known for their success.
Exactly. The potion plan is, let's just say it's a long shot. And it shows how quickly hope can turn into recklessness when you're not thinking clearly.
And it's not just Romeo and Juliet who suffer the consequences, is it?
Definitely not. I mean, look at Lord Capulet. He goes through such a transformation in this play. One minute he's trying to be the cool dad, and the next he is just unhinged.
Well, imagine how you'd feel if your daughter refused to marry the guy you'd chosen for her.
Right. And back then, a father's authority was everything. So for Juliet to defy him like that, it's a direct challenge to his power, to the whole social order.
So his reaction, as crazy as it seems to us now,
Yeah.
it made sense back then.
In the context of that time, yeah. He's trying to exert control over a situation that's spiraling out of control. And it raises this really interesting question about how much Shakespeare is condemning Capulet versus holding up a mirror to the society that created him.
It's like he's saying, this is what happens, folks, when you let these societal pressures, these expectations rule your lives. And it never ends well, does it?
No, it really doesn't. And in this case, it leads to that devastating climax, the final act, the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet's deaths.
Which we all know, of course. But what's interesting is what happens afterwards, right? Because it's easy to get so caught up in their love story, in that final tragic moment, that we forget there's a whole other scene after they die.
Right, with the families.
Exactly. They come together, finally realizing the damage they've done, the feud, all of it. And it's like this sudden reconciliation.
It's a moment that always feels a little bit, I don't know, unearned.
Too little, too late.
Yes, exactly. Like it took the deaths of their children for them to finally see sense.
It's kind of infuriating, isn't it? But at the same time, it does make you wonder if that was the only way to break that cycle of hatred. Like it took something this tragic to make them stop and really look at each other.
That's the question Shakespeare leaves us with, right? Could Romeo and Juliet have found happiness if they'd lived? Or was their tragedy, this awful loss, the only thing powerful enough to change things? To force their families to let go of that hatred?
It's a tough question. And then there's that whole thing with the statues, right? Because they decide, the families, to build these golden statues of Romeo and Juliet. And I don't know, it always felt kind of strange to me. Like, is that really enough? A statue after everything that's happened?
It's an ending that always leaves me feeling a bit unsettled because, yeah, on the one hand, it suggests that something good came out of all that suffering.
Their deaths weren't completely in vain.
Exactly. But those statues, they're also this constant reminder of the price that was paid, right? The devastating consequences of all that hatred.
A very heavy reminder. So where does that leave us? We've journeyed through the passionate love, the societal pressures, those tragic choices that led to such a heartbreaking end. And it's amazing to think that after all this time, centuries later, Romeo and Juliet still has this power to move us, to make us think.
It's a story that really gets under your skin, doesn't it? And I think it's because it taps into these universal truths about being human. That intensity of first love, the desire to define yourself, to be your own person, the destructive nature of hate, the hope for forgiveness, for reconciliation. Those are things we still struggle with today.
It's like human nature hasn't really changed all that much, has it? Even though the world around us is completely different.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to keep having these conversations, to revisit these classic works and see what they can teach us about ourselves, about the world we live in.
To use them as a lens, right?
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm going to leave you with one final and kind of provocative question to ponder. Does Romeo and Juliet, in the end, condemn or romanticize this idea of passionate love in the face of societal pressures? It's something to think about.